Page 510. Attitude toward government work. The Zeks have an absolutely false concept of work as something designed to suck their whole lives from them, which means that their chief salvation is this: while working, not to become absorbed in the work. It is well known to a Zek that you can't do all the work. Never rush, thinking that the sooner you finish, the sooner you can sit down and take a rest. The moment you sit down, you will be immediately given other work to do. Work loves fools. But how do you do it? Do you flatly refuse to work? That is the worst thing a Zek can do. He will rot in punishment blocks, die of starvation. Going to work is unavoidable, but once there, during the workday, what he has to do is not slog away, but fiddle about, and not bend the back, but loaf cold brick, which is to say, not work anyway. The native will never openly or flatly refuse to perform any order. That would be the end of him. Instead, what he does is stretch the rubber. Stretching the rubber is one of the principal concepts and expressions of the archipelago. This is the Zek's main salvation and achievement, subsequently widely adopted by the sloggers out in freedom as well. The Zek listens carefully to all the orders he is given and nods his head affirmatively, and he goes off to carry out those orders, but he does not carry them out. Most often of all, he does not even begin. This sometimes leads to despair on the part of the purposeful and inexhaustible commanders of production, and naturally the desire arises to hit him with a fist in the nose or on the back of the neck, this stupid dumb animal in tatters. After all, he has been told in the Russian language. What doltish obtuseness is this? But that's the point. The Russian language is ill understood by the natives, and a whole series of contemporary concepts, such as workers' honor and conscientious discipline, have no equivalents in their wretched language. However, no sooner has the chief rushed in for a second time than the Zek obediently bends his back beneath the cursing and immediately begins to carry out the orders. The heart of the employer softens a little. He goes on with his multitudinous urgent task of management, and the Zek, behind his back, immediately sits down and stops working. If there is no brigadier's fist hanging over his head, if he is not threatened with being deprived of his bread ration today, and also if there is no bait in the shape of time-off sentence. It is difficult for us normal people to understand this psychology, but this is how it is. Obtuseness. Quite the contrary. It is the highest degree of understanding and adaptation to conditions. What can he count on? After all, work does not get done by itself. And if the chief comes around once more, will that be any worse? But here's what he's counting on. Most likely of all, the chief won't come around for the third time today. And you have to survive until tomorrow. Tonight, the Zek might be sent off on a prisoner transport or transferred to another brigade, or put in hospital or imprisoned in the punishment block. And whatever he has done today will then be credited to someone else. Or tomorrow, that same Zek, that same brigade, might well be transferred to some other work, or else the chief might decide that what they were doing isn't necessary or ought to be done quite differently. And on the basis of many such cases, the Zek has firmly mastered the truth. Had firmly mastered the truth. Do not do today what you can do tomorrow. Or in Zek lingo, wherever you sit down is where you get off. He is fearful of not expending an extra calorie. He is fearful of expending an extra calorie where it maybe doesn't need to be expended. Incidentally, the concept of calories is well known and very popular among the natives, and that is how the Zek talk frankly among themselves. The one who pulls is the one they urge on. and the one who doesn't supposedly is let off with a shrug. In general, the Zek works just to get through the day to the night. But at this point, scholarly integrity obliges us to admit a certain weakness in the course of our reasoning. In our course of reasoning, first of all, because the camp rule of the one who pulls is the one they urge on turns out to be simultaneously an old Russian proverb. And we also find in Dal another purely Zekish expression. He lives just to get through the day to the night. Now this coincidence arouses a whole whirlwind of thoughts in us. At school, a school of mythology, the theory of borrowing, the theory of migratory themes, a school of mythology, continuing these dangerous comparisons we find among the Russian proverbs and sayings which took shape under serfdom and were all already well established by the 19th century, the following: don't do the work, don't run from the work. Astonishing, this is the very principle of camp rubber. May God grant we know how to do everything, but not do it at all. You will never finish the master's work. A zealous horse doesn't live long. He'll give you a chunk of bread, and for that you'll have it to thresh for a whole week. This is very much like the Zeks reactionary theory that even a big bread ration doesn't make up for the expenditure in energy and labor. So what, in conclusion, is to be drawn from all this? That across all the bright boundary lines of our emancipatory reforms, our enlightenment, our revolutions, and our socialism, the serfs of the Empress Catherine's time and the Zeks of Stalin's time, notwithstanding their complete dissimilarity in social position, reach out to shake each other's black and horny hands. That is impossible. At this point, our erudition breaks down, and we'll return to our exposition. From the Zek's relationship to his work, there follows also his relationship to his chiefs. Outwardly, the Zek is very obedient. For example, one of the Zek commandants is one of the Zek commandments is don't stick out your neck. In other words, never talk back to the chiefs. In appearance, the Zek is very much afraid of the chief, bends his back when a chief scolds him, or even just stands near him. But, in fact, this is a simple calculation to avoid unnecessary punishments. In actual fact, the Zek utterly despises the bosses, both the camp chiefs and the production chiefs, but covertly conceals it so as not to suffer from it. Departing in a throng after any sort of work announcements, reprimands, or official rebukes, the Zek laugh quite quietly among themselves. It may have been said, but we'll all manage to forget it. The Zeks inwardly consider themselves to be the superiors of their chiefs. Both in literacy and in their mastery of work skills, and in their general level of comprehension of the circumstances of life. And one has to admit that is how it is often. But here, in their self-satisfaction, the Zeks fail to see that. On the other hand, the administration of the islands possesses a permanent superiority over the natives by virtue of its world outlook. That is why the naive concept of the Zeks that the chief's principles and I do as I please, or the law here is me, is really quite unfounded. However, this gives us a convenient opportunity to draw a distinction between the native status and the old Russian serfdom. The serf peasant did not like his nobleman owner and made fun of him, but had grown accustomed to feeling something superior in him, as a result of which there was a multitude of characters like Savlich and Furs who were dedicated slaves. But now this spiritual slavery has ended once and for all, and among the tens of millions of Zeks it is quite impossible to imagine even one who sincerely worships its chief. And in this respect, there is an important national difference between the Zeks and your and my compatriots, dear reader. The Zeks do not strive for praise, nor for honorary diplomas, nor to have their names posted on the red bulletin boards of honor, unless they are directly tied in with the supplementary rations. Everything that is called the glory of labor out in freedom is for the Zeks, in their stupidity, only a dull and hollow sound. In this, they are all the more independent of their guardians and of the necessity to please. As a generalization, the entire scale of values is topsy-turvy among the Zeks, but this need not surprise us if we recall that it's always the way among the savages. It's always that way among savages. For a tiny little mirror, they are willing to part with a big fat pig. For cheap little beads, with a basket of cocoa beans. Those things that are precious to us, dear reader, such as ideological values, self-sacrifice, dedication, and the desire to labor selflessly for the future, these are not only quite absent among the Zeks, but are even considered worthless. It is enough to say that the Zeks are totally deprived of patriotic sentiment and do not like their own native islands in the least. Let us recall the words of their own folk song. Be thou damned, O Kolyma. Snakes invented this planet. Because of this, they rarely undertake long and risky journeys in search of happiness, which are called in their dialect escapes. Most highly esteemed among all the Zeks. Most highly esteemed of all among the Zeks, occupying first place in terms of the value placed on it, is the bread ration, a piece of black bread with additives in it, badly baked, which you and I would be unwilling to eat. Among the Zeks, the bigger and heavier the ration is, the more precious it is. Anyone who has ever seen the greed with which the Zeks will hurl themselves on their morning bread ration, almost devouring their hands along with it, will have a difficult time ever erasing that unaesthetic recollection from his mind. Second place among them, occupied by makorka, or homegrown tobacco, and the rates of exchange involving these things are wildly arbitrary, and don't pay the least heed to the amount of socially useful labor invested in the one or the other. This is all the more monstrous in that among the makorka, occupies the place, so to speak, of a universal currency. There is no monetary system on the islands. Third place is occupied by gruel, which is an island soup without fats, without meats, without grits or vegetables, in accordance with native customs, probably even the marching of grenadiers in a parade, in exact step with one another, in gleaming uniforms and flourishing weapons, does not leave such a fearsome impression on the viewer as does the evening entry of a brigade of Zeks into a mess hall to get their gruel. Those shaven heads, those slapdash caps, tatters tied together with strings, those mean crooked faces, how do they get those muscles and sinews from that gruel? And in they go, with 25 pairs of shoes and a rope of bast sandals. Tap, 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 left, right. Give us our ration, bosses. Anyone who is not of our faith, get out of the way. And on the 25 faces, at the moment of seizing their prey, the national character of the Zeks is disclosed to you distinct and clear. We note the fact that in reaching conclusions about the Zeks, we can hardly imagine them as individuals, their separate personalities and names. But that is not the fault of our method. It is a reflection of that herd structure of life in which this outlandish people lives, renouncing family life and the creation of heirs. which are so traditional among other peoples. They are convinced that their population will be replenished by other means. This collective way of life is extremely characteristic of the archipelago. Be an inheritance from primitive society or the dawn of the future. Probably it is the future. The most highly valued thing among the Zeks is sleep. A normal human being can only be astounded at how much a Zek is capable of sleeping and in what varied circumstances. One hardly needs say that insomnia is quite unknown amongst them. They take no sleeping pills. They sleep every night through without waking, and if they happen to get a day free of work, they sleep right through it. It has been reliably established that they are able to fall asleep when seated behind empty hand barrels while the latter are being loaded. They are able to fall asleep out at line-up with their legs spread wide apart, and they are also able to fall asleep even when marching under guard to work, but not all of them. Some of them keel over and wake up. And the basis of all this, during sleep the sentence passes more quickly, and in addition, the night is for sleep and the day is for rest. Let us return to the image of the brigade stamping in to get its lawful, as they call it, gruel. We see an expression here for one of the principal national traits of the Zek people, vital drive. Nor does this contradict their inclination to keep dropping off to sleep. That is, in fact, why they sleep, so as to have this strength for their drive in the interim. This drive is both literal and physical, and continues right up to the finish line of their goals: food, a warm stove, a clothes dryer, shelter from the rain. And in all that pushing and shoving, the Zek does not hesitate to stick his shoulder in his neighbor's side. And if two Zeks are going to pick up a tree trunk, both of them head for the top end, so that the other will get the thick end. And this drive exists in a more general sense, a drive to get the most advantageous position in life. In the cruel island conditions, so close to the conditions of life in the animal kingdom that we can, without fear or contradiction, apply here Darwinian struggle for life. Life itself often depends on success or failure in the struggle for a place. And in driving a path for oneself at the cost of others, the natives acknowledge no restraining ethical principles. They themselves say straight out, conscience, you got left in my case file. In taking vital decisions, they are guided by the well-known rule of the archipelago: it is better to be a son of a bitch than to suffer. But this drive can be successful only if it is accompanied by practical agility and resourcefulness in the most difficult situations. The Zek has to manifest this quality every day, and for the simplest and the most insignificant purposes, to safeguard his pitiful dregs of property: some dented mess tin, stinking rags, and a wooden spoon, his handy needle. However, in the struggle for an important position in the island hierarchy, even this resourcefulness must become calculated trickery of a superior, more subtle, more ingenious order, so as not to weigh down this inquiry. Here is one example. A certain Zek managed to secure the important position of chief of the camp workshops. Certain kinds of work were successfully carried out in his workshops, and others not. But the strength of his position depended not so much on the successful completion of his work as on his ability to bluff. Some MVD officers came to his office and saw some ceramic cones on his desk. What are they? Saker cones. What are they for? To determine the temperature inside the ovens. Ah, drawled out the chief, thinking to himself, well, I certainly put a good engineer in the job. But those cones could not be used to determine temperature through their melting point, because they weren't made of standardized clay and their composition was unknown. The cones started to become overfamiliar, and soon the chief of the workshops had a new toy on his desk, an optical instrument without a single lens. Where in the archipelago could you find a lens? And again, everyone was astounded, and the Zeks' mind had continually to be occupied with such sideways feints as these. According to the circumstances and his psychological appraisal of the enemy, Zek had to demonstrate flexibility of conduct, ranging from a crude move with fist or voice up to the most delicate kind of pretense, from total shamelessness to sacred fidelity to a promise given face to face, which one would not think to be at all compulsory. Thus, for some reason, all Zeks were faithful as saints to their promises of secret bribes and exceptionally patient and conscientious in carrying out private commissions. When we see some wonderful archipelago handicraft work with carving and inlays, the likes of which can otherwise be seen only in the Ostankino Museum, it is impossible to believe that this was done by those same hands which turned over to the foreman work, that was held together only by a peg so that it would fall apart immediately. This flexibility of conduct was also reflected in the famous Zek rule: if they give, take it; if they beat, beat it. The most important condition of success in the struggle of the GULag Islanders is their secretiveness. Their character and their intentions are so profoundly hidden that to inexperienced novice employer, it seems at the outset as if the Zeks bend like a blade of grass beneath the wind and the boot. Only subsequently does he become bitterly convinced that the cunning and insincerity of the islanders. Secretiveness is almost the most characteristic trait of the Zek tribe. The Zek has to hide his intentions and acts, both from the employers and from the jailers. And from the brigadiers, and from the so-called stoolies. He has to conceal his successes so that they will not be outdone. He has to conceal his plans, his calculations, and his hopes, whether he be preparing for a big escape or has figured out where to collect shavings for a mattress. In the Zek life, it is always the case that to disclose means to lose. One native, whom I treated to my kolka, explained it to me this way. I present it here in translation. If you disclose a warm place to sleep, where the foreman won't find you, everyone will rush there, and the foreman will smell it out. If you disclose that you have sent a letter through a free person, then everyone else will hand his letters to that free person, and they will catch him with the letters. And if the storeroom clerk has promised to exchange your torn shirt, shut up till you have exchanged it, and when you have, shut up some more. You won't give him away, and he will be useful to you later on. With the years, the Zek becomes so accustomed to hiding everything that he no longer has to exert any effort at all to this end. The natural human desire to share what he has experienced dies in him. So we perhaps recognize his secretiveness, some sort of defense reaction against the secret course of events in general. After all, they also do all they can to conceal from him information concerning his own fate. The secretiveness of the Zek flows also from his all-around mistrustfulness. He mistrusts everyone around him. An act that appears to be unselfish arouses his especially strong suspicion. The law of the taiga. That is how he formulates the highest imperative of human relationships. On the islands of the archipelago, there really are great taiga. The native who in the highest degree combines and manifests these tribal qualities, the drive for life, pitilessness, resourcefulness, secretiveness, and mistrustfulness, calls himself, and is called by others, a son of GULag. This among them is like the title honorary citizen, and it is acquired, of course, through long years of life on the islands. A son of GULag believes himself impenetrable, and also that he, on the contrary, can see right through those around him, and as the phrase goes, 6 feet beneath him too. Maybe this is so, but at this point it becomes apparent that even the most penetrating of the Zeks possess a narrow range of outlook, a short view ahead, while judging very soberly actions close to them, and while very precise in calculating their behavior in the hours immediately ahead. The rank-and-file Zeks, and even the sons of GULag 2, are incapable either of thinking abstractly or of grasping phenomena of a general nature, or even of speaking about the future. Even in their grammar, the future tense is very rarely used. Even with regard to the morrow, it is applied with a conditional nuance, and still more carefully to the subsequent days of the same week, and you will never hear from a Zek such a sentence as "next spring I will," because they all know that they still have to make it through the winter, and that any day fate can hurl them from one island to another. In real truth, my day is my epoch. The sons of GULag are also the chief bearers of the tradition and the so-called Zek commandments. On the various islands, the number of these commandments varies, and they are not always formulated the same way either. And to work toward their systematization would be a very interesting subject for a separate inquiry. These commandments have nothing in common with Christianity. The Zeks are not only an atheistic people, but in general, nothing is sacred to them, and they always hasten to ridicule and degrade anything lofty, and this too is reflected in their language. But, as the sons of GULag affirm, if you live according to their commandments, you will not perish in the archipelago. There are certain precepts such as "don't squeal." How is one to understand this? Evidently they are desirous of avoiding superfluous noise. And "don't lick the bowls." In other words, do not descend to slobs, something they consider a swift and abrupt way to die. And "don't scavenge," and others. There is an interesting commandment: "Don't shove your nose in someone else's mess tin." This seems to us to represent a great achievement of native thought. You see, this is the principle of negative freedom. It is the slogan, "My home is my castle," turn around, so to speak, and even improved upon. But it is a matter not of one's own mess tin, but of someone else's. And yet, one's own is, of course, understood. Knowing the native conditions, we have to understand here the term mess tin in the broadest sense, not merely as a dented and sooty dish, nor even as a specific unappetizing dishwater contained in it, but also as all the means of getting something to eat, all the means in the struggle for existence, and even more broadly, as the Zek's soul. In a word, let me live as I wish, and you live as you wish. This is what this precept means. A hard and cruel son of GULag, under this precept, undertakes the obligation not to use his strength and drive out of empty curiosity, but at the same time, he frees himself of any kind of moral obligation. Even if you are croaking right next to me, it's none of my affair. This is a cruel law, yet it is much more humane than the law of thieves, the island cannibals. You today, me tomorrow. The cannibal thief is not in the least indifferent to his neighbor. He will speed up the latter's death so as to put off his own, sometimes just for the hell of it, or even for the amusement of watching it. Finally, there is one composite commandment: don't trust, don't fear, don't beg. In this commandment, the common national character of the Zek is cast, like a piece of sculpture, with sharp definition. How can one, in freedom, rule over people which is totally steeped in such a proud commandment. It is awesome even to think of it. This commandment leads us to consider not so much the lifestyle of the Zeks as their psychological essence. The first thing we note from the start in a son of GULag, and then observe more and more frequently, is spiritual equilibrium, psychological stability. In this regard, the Zeks' general, overall philosophical view of its place in the universe is highly interesting. As distinct from the Englishman or the Frenchman, who is proud all his life of having been born an Englishman or a Frenchman, the Zek is not at all proud of his national affiliation. On the contrary, he perceives it as a cruel trial, but a trial he wishes to endure with dignity. The Zeks have a particularly notable myth, which holds that somewhere there exist the gates of the archipelago. Compare with the pillars of Hercules in antiquity, and that outside of these gates there is a sign for those who enter, do not lose heart, and on the other side there is a sign for those who are leaving, do not be overjoyed. And the main thing the Zeks add is that these signs are visible only to the wise, and fools do not see them. Often this myth is expressed as a simple rule of life. Newly arriving, do not be sad. Newly departing, do not be glad. It is in this key that the views of the Zeks on the archipelago and on the life taking place in the space abutting on it must be perceived. Such a philosophy is the source of the Zeks' psychological stability. No matter how darkly circumstances may be stacked against him, he knits the brows of his rough and weathered face and says, "They cannot drop me any deeper than a mine." Or they comfort each other, "It could be worse." And in reality, this conviction, "it could be even worse," clearly supports and encourages them in the most profound suffering of famine, cold, and spiritual depression. The Zek is always expecting it to be worse. That is how he lives, constantly awaiting the blows of fate and the stings of the evil spirit. And on the other hand, he perceives every temporary relaxation as an oversight, a mistake. In this constant expectation of misfortune, the austere soul of the Zek matures, stoically hardened to its own fate, and pitiless towards the fate of others. The Zek's deviations from his state of equilibrium are very minor, either on the dark side or on the bright side, either on the side of despair or on the side of happiness. This was felicitously expressed by Taras Shevchenko, who spent a little time on the islands in prehistoric times. "I now have almost neither grief nor gladness. On the other hand, there is a moral calm like the cold-bloodedness of a fish." Is it possible that constant suffering can rework a human being in this way? Indeed, yes it can. A stable, indifferent state of mind is the Zek's indispensable defense, so he can survive long years of grim island life. And he does not attain this smoldering, lustreless state of mind in the first year in the archipelago. Ordinarily, he dies. Once he has attained it, he continues to live. In a word, if you don't kick the bucket, you'll become an adept. All the Zek's feelings are dulled, and his nerves coarsened, having become indifferent to his own grief and to the punishments which the guardians of the tribe have laid upon him. And even by then, almost to his whole life, he does not experience any spiritual sympathy for the grief of those around him either. Somebody's outcry of pain, or even women's tears, barely compel him to turn his head. So dulled have his reactions become. Often the Zeks show no mercy to its inexperienced newcomers and laugh at their errors and misfortune. But do not judge them severely for this. They are not doing it out of malice. Their Their sympathies have simply atrophied, and all that remains noticeable to them is the funny side of events. The most prevalent world outlook among them is fatalism. This is their proud universal trait. It is to be explained by their dependent situation, their total lack of knowledge of what will happen to them even in the most immediate future, and their actual inability to influence events. Fatalism is even necessary to the Zek because it confirms him in his spiritual stability. The son of GULag believes that the most tranquil course is to put his faith in fate. The future is a cat in a sack, a pig in a poke, and not understanding it clearly and having no idea what's going to happen to you in the possible variations of life lying ahead. You don't need to strive too insistently for something or reject something too obstinately, be it a transfer to another barracks or brigade or camp. Maybe it will be for the better, maybe it will be for the worse, but you are free of self-reproaches. Let it be worse for you, but it wasn't done by your own hands. And this is how you preserve that precious feeling of dauntlessness, how you save yourself from fussing and ingratiating. Given such a dark faith, the Zeks have many strong superstitions. One of them is closely bound up with their fatalism. If you worry too much about your conditions, or even your own comfort, you are bound to get burned by a prisoner transport. The fatalism widely prevalent among them extends not only to their personal fate, but also to the overall course of things. The last thing in their mind is that the overall course of events could be changed. They imagine that the archipelago has existed for all of eternity, and that earlier it was even worse. But probably the most interesting psychological twist here is the fact that the Zeks perceive their own stable state of equanimity in these primitive and wretched circumstances as a victory for love of life. It is quite enough for this sequence of misfortunes to slow down a little, for the blows of fate to slacken just a little, for the Zek to express his satisfaction with life, and to take pride in his own conduct in it. Perhaps the reader will find it easier to believe in this paradoxical trait if we cite Chekhov. In his story, in exile, the boatman, Semyon Tolkavi, expresses the feeling as follows, quote, I have brought myself to the point where I can sleep naked on the earth and eat grass, and may God grant everyone a life like that. I need nothing and I fear no one, and I understand myself so well that no man is richer or freer than I. These astonishing words still ring in our ears, and we have heard them many times from Zeks of the archipelago. And the only surprise is, where could Chekhov have picked them up? And may God grant everyone a life like that. How would you like that? Thank you for listening.